So let it be written, so let it be done. This is Tabletop Terrors, and we are going to talk about the shared progress of RPGs. And this is the deep dive that is inspired by being a creator who shares creative processes. And so it's just really interesting to me, and we started talking about it, is that like more than ever, tabletop RPGs are a community-driven, like social construct. Because people can stream games and share their homebrew stuff so quickly and easily, I've never seen so many people adopt like a critical hit variant so quickly, and it's widely used, or a specific way to do initiative. Whereas before, the way that you would have that happen is one publisher would write it and create it, and then maybe another publisher would in a separate asynchronous book. But now it seems like there's this kind of really interesting shared progress. And I really wanted to talk about that because I've seen, since, for me, the focus of like what I'm thinking is, since the release of Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition almost 6 years ago, I feel like more and more multiple systems feed off each other, find something that, you know, is done well, and then sort of extrapolate. And I think that's a good thing. What do you guys think?
So, I mean, overall, I agree that it is a very good thing. And it's interesting to me because to some degree, I've never heard anybody talk about this or talked about this. There are things like that, like initiative, that people are happy to hack and homebrew and change, and people are so okay with it. And there are things that aren't. I think that it can be a pretty clear line as far as like, if I go, well, in my game, Rangers are just totally different. Here's the homebrew. I'm like, well, that's different because it's changing the whole game. But there are so many things like that where some people go, oh, in this game, instead of rolling dice, I used tarot cards and we decided what that meant. And to some degree, that, like you said, it's a community-driven thing. The sharing of those ideas is allowing more people to have fun and potentially a different kind of fun, right? They're varying their game setup, sometimes with something like different crits, where, like you said, so many people do critical hits different. At least in my experience, because it's something that happens rarely enough that it's almost like kind of fun to go, hey guys, we're going to do a different kind of critical hits, and then to get to that, there's an enjoyability of, oh, okay, now what do we do? You know what I mean? You've critically hit. It's like it adds more to it. So that's getting a little more off onto why it's good, but to some degree, kind of starting at, if we didn't have that quick adoption of ideas, and people were like hid more what they want to do, or in some way disallowed you from trying it, I do think that it would bring the community down as a whole for sure.
Yeah, and one way that I think it's kind of useful to think about all these different ways of, small rules adjustments or rules ideas, it's like there are different tools that can express the game feeling differently. So if you use cards instead of dice or whatever, things like that can, at the end of the example, not change the game that much, in the sense of like, you either still hit or not and do damage or not, and so on. But the way that you get from point A to point B can make the game feel very differently. And those different tools can be very useful in sort of creating the way that you want your game to feel. So the more that people kind of allow those things to be out, the more kind of ways that we have to express our ideas and express our desired sort of game state in a way that can basically make everybody's games have more options to do the things that they want to be able to do. And sometimes there are just developments in a certain game system that are so like profound and intuitive that a lot of people want to use them. And as the others have said, like, I think that's a good thing. And I think that we need to be able to look at those things and say, like, yes, it's okay that, if I come up with, I think one of the examples that I've seen the most is things like range bands for movement distance, of instead of 30 feet or 50 feet, there's close, there's like engaged with, there's close, there's medium, there's far, and then there's like very far or extreme or whatever. And that sort of thing is the sort of thing where it's like, that is so useful and so short and quick and easy for so many different games that I've seen range bands adopted in a lot of different games. And I don't know who did it first. The first place that I ever saw it was Fantasy Flight Games, but I've also seen it in like Black Hack and a ton of other systems. And yeah, I think that it's totally okay and fair to say like, oh, range bands, that's cool. I like that. I'm going to use that for my game because it makes my game feel the way that I want it to feel. It's quick, it's easy, it's intuitive, it's fast, you know? And I think that it's to me, it's almost kind of like looking at something like the invention of the car versus like people using horses and carriages, where it's like, if somebody invents a car, it's like very obviously better and more efficient in a lot of ways than the horse and carriage. And I don't think anybody would say only that guy gets to use a car because he thought of it first, when it's like so obviously a useful tool for everybody. And there's definitely a line there of like, you don't want to just take an entire person's system, like paint it a different color and be like, I made a new thing just for me. Like there's a place in between where it starts to get fuzzy, but generally speaking, especially for very small chunks of design, it's just better for everybody to consider those things like language, where it's like, just like you can't own a word or a sound or like a broad idea, that those small chunks of design are useful tools of expression in that same sort of way that should be usable by a lot of people.
Yeah, and we have a unique benefit. Excuse me. We are part of a community called the Absolute Tabletop Facebook group. And so I think it's really cool because we get to see this sort of like petri dish, like, or it's almost like this experiment where you can watch this happen. Like, this is going to sound super basic, but that is where I learned how to do an interest post properly, in my opinion, when I say properly, you know? So I think when one person nails it and you're like, oh, that's really cool to include thematic buzzwords so that people know what kind of game it is, that's more useful than maybe 3 paragraphs, you know? And it's like, oh, and then people start using images, you know? And it's like, oh, here goes a mood board of what the game is like. And just all those things, it's like, you know, Jeff, like what you're saying, it's the best way to do it. You kind of look at it and then you see every once in a while, it'll get tweaked one more time. And it's like, oh, that's actually really clever. One of the cool things too, because this topic spans into professional publishing as well as our own tables and our own experiences. So I think that's also neat, but I'm going to focus on how, as a game master and a role player, I have changed entirely by playing in other people's games. And you just go, oh yeah, I'm going to do that now. That is great. Like that's the new way I'm going to do it. And I love that so many people do it their own way that it's not even going to be the same. So even if I did the quote unquote same thing, I'm going to do it my way and add my things like you were talking about in the other video, Jeff. And so even when we do take someone's exact thing, there's no way it can be their exact thing because it's now you doing it. And it's like, it's really fun to watch the style of the games that are run, the, you know, character creation methods and all that stuff. It feels more like we have this neat, almost like this little microcosm of like our own version of like the music industry or the RPG industry. It's like really cool to see the eras that the Absolute Tabletop Facebook group goes through.
I really like where you're going with that because this is a bit of a lofty idea, but I'll try and summarize it and fit it into terms of what you're talking about here. But one of the big things that sets humans apart from, say, anything else that can't sort of record and communicate a concept is that very idea that given the ability to record and convey a concept would change so much. Imagine you're a lion and you're like, man, I'm not a very good hunter. I wish I was better. Imagine if you could read a book on how to hunt better. As humans, we have that because the concept is, so Tim, okay, well, actually, here's a really good one, the alphabet. we all agree, there's a word for our ABCD alphabet, whatever. Assume for a minute that I'm not being insensitive, but I say the regular English alphabet. The English alphabet, we all agree on. They make words. The words make things. That's something that somebody came up with and evolved over time. It's just so ubiquitous that we all use it. There's nothing special or inherent in the universe about the alphabet. It's just that it allows us to do things better, convey concepts. It's the same with a good initiative system, a range band system. Another really good one is the Black Hack. And I don't know that they came up with it, but the Black Hack's usage die, where you roll a die and if you get a certain number, the amount of uses you have on that potion lowers. Instead of I have 5, I used 5, that's it. Creates really cool tension. Those concepts just make the game better if those are things you enjoy. But that's all, right? There's no monetary value directly on that exact thing. So like you said, Tim, with the eras of the Absolute Tabletop group and with even just RPGs in general, it is very interesting to watch because it just keeps getting better. But even so much of those things that you've touched on are not published. They're not official. They're not something that somebody goes, we made this and we own it. The idea of the interest post is like, no, that's just a better way for us to communicate and more quickly get to and more efficiently get to the thing we want to do. And so that's another really good example of why it's so important not to hide the things that make your game better or your life better, or as Tim said in the last video, his drive to work better, because it's making everything better.
Yeah, and I can echo Tim's sentiment specifically of some of the way that I run my games now has been so radically influenced by playing in other people's games and seeing their little tricks and their little systems of the way that I do initiative, the way that I do interest posts, the way that I do all those things has been affected by a bunch of different people. And I think that that's part of the important thing too, is that if you're going to be taking a lot of ideas, that you take a lot of ideas from a lot of people, because there's a very big difference, I think, to me between I want to make exactly what they made, so I'm just going to make their thing, versus this is cool, this is cool, this is cool. I'm going to take everything that I like and kind of run it through myself and kind of get to an endpoint that only I could get to, because it's kind of being filtered through my own lens. So even if I do use Tim's initiative system and James's way of naming, towns or whatever, because I've taken both of them and from other people and from my own ideas and all these different things, the end point becomes something that none of us could have made without kind of all of that collectively coming together. And the more that we can do that for each other, the more that just everybody's games are better. I don't think that you necessarily, especially when it comes to tips for running games, with the way that you do initiative, the way that you make an encounter, things like that. There's not really any benefit to hiding those things publicly, because James is saying, there's not really necessarily even a monetary benefit of compared to if you were publishing, a book or whatever that you wanted to. But even then, I still think you should share your secrets, just to be clear. But yeah, there's so much knowledge that we can gain from being involved in other people's games and seeing their little things and taking what we like, forgetting what we don't, and then kind of ending up with our own unique thing that then we can then put out and other people can do the same thing. I think the collective evolution is a great way to put it, in the sense of, the endpoint that we've reached as a community now, the level and quality of games that are consistently happening is just insane in that group, because everybody's been so hyper willing to just put everything out there into the world. And everybody in that group is better for it. And I know many dozens of people in that group who have taken things from each other and added things into the pot, before they take out, and all these different things. And yeah, everyone in the community is more creative, more efficient, more expressive than they've been basically since I've met any of them, because of the fact that they and everybody else is willing to kind of build on each other's shoulders.
Yeah, and we've talked a lot about I think mechanical stuff, which I think is, it's key. That's important. But I also think that there's something to be said of sort of the lore side as well. And I think it can be a little touchier, because you don't want to take someone's lore And it's like, but if you're not a publisher, you can. And that's a cool thing about RPGs. So here's what I mean. There are some brilliant people who come up with some amazing concepts in the Absolute Tabletop Facebook group. So it's like, this is the way I'm going to handle deities, and this is the way I'm going to handle, gnolls, and the way that, and it's like, oh, hey, if you're just running a home game and your players aren't in the AbTab group, and even if they are, it doesn't matter. You can take that and go, hey, cool, now I have gnolls for, XYZ homebrew setting. But one of the things that I found, and this is on the professional publishing side, is that, I work with James, I work with Matt, Barker, Jeff, Lloyd, Chris, especially with the Core 4 AbTab. When you build a world, there's something really cool about seeing the pattern that someone builds and then trying to figure out what fills that thematic role in your world. So it's almost like, James, you were talking about, what do you call them? Design patterns, I think.
Yeah.
So there are sort of these monolithic design patterns that can be traced through different campaign settings. And so it's like, who's your big bad? And, that's a very common one. But say a place like Dragongryn, where you have the dismembered lord and evil has won, Barker can then take and say, okay, how is Enkea different? Because that's not the story here. But the design pattern is there an overarching evil? Is there... And it's really neat to see lore-wise how you can be absolutely inspired by something and the shared progress of someone posting and you going, oh, I see they've identified a new pattern. And then you can take the pattern and yours is totally different. I'm doing like feudal Japan real world, but I can take your, steampunk design pattern and I can say, okay, who would that be in this? And who would that be? And how would this work? And that's a neat concept too, creatively to me.
And I think that it feeds well the publishing side, especially because we're a publisher with this community. It creates a feedback loop in a sense where I'm going to use our books as specific ideas because I'm very familiar with them. I also think that the ideas in them are very good, but it's not to say they're the best. Specifically with our upcoming book, A Dead Man's Guide to Dragongryn, Tim, and we all kind of workshopped it, but Tim really came up with the bones of it and went through a lot of different iterations, specifically the template of what we need to tell the reader about a region. We call them Dominions of Ash. It's a thematic, but it's a region template, we call it. And there are a lot of things in it, but it's like, here are a few things you need to know. Here's kind of who rules it. Here are the important people. It's a pattern. It's a template that if you filled it out with your own information would make a region that you could run around it. And if you took that whole cloth, again, take all the Dragongryn out of it, and like you said, Tim, put your own stuff in. But then the real beauty, in my opinion, is you go, oh, but in my world, I need a spot about this other type of faction that's in every region. So I add that to my template and this and that. And then suddenly by the end of you filling out the template, or even if whether you're creating it for your own world or something else, by the end, your template is very different. It's probably very reminiscent of the one that maybe you used, but it doesn't matter either way because all you've done is take the same information, the lore that you didn't know how to put together, and you found slots for everything to slide in. And you go, oh, I don't know who the big bad is. So you know what? I'll come back to that, but I know I need one now. It is it in my opinion, helps the efficiency of creation so much when you know what you need to create. One of the biggest problems I have is, okay, well, I have this really cool idea for this world. Where do I start? And like, even starting with a template, even going, you know what? I got halfway through and this template is not what I need. That is a breakthrough that you wouldn't have gotten without the template, even if you don't use it. So yeah, again, like you said, that evolution is so cool. And that's where it comes from, is taking, and I love the concept of design patterns specifically. They're not sort of official, but that's a really good example of one, because it also allows the what is called an anti-pattern, which is, hey, here's a way a lot of people do it, and it's not good because of this reason. And even having that shared vocabulary is very helpful, because I can point to something and go, oh, I want to use something like that, the way that book did it. And that immediately puts you on the same page with me. So yeah, it's just without that, we could create the same things, but they would take a lot longer and they would never be as good.
Yeah, something that James, you touched on there that I was going to talk about. So I'm glad that you kind of accidentally segued into it, because I think it's very important, is that another benefit of sharing ideas and being exposed to a lot of different ideas, it can be just as useful to find a way of doing something that you know that you don't like and finding out why you don't like it than it can be to find an idea that you do like that you end up using. Because it can kind of get you thinking about the game in different ways and kind of make you realize things about the way that you understand the system that you wouldn't have necessarily come to if you didn't see that. So like one example for me, so I'm somebody who generally likes like a game in the game. You know, I like the fact that there's, you know, mechanics that I can rely on and, you know, follow through on and kind of go into those sorts of details. So I always kind of imagined myself as being someone who liked games that are really crunchy. Because, well, like I like rules, I like being able to play the game. That's really cool. And as I kind of started to look at all these different ideas, like one of many examples that I could give on this sort of thing is like seeing initiative systems where somebody was like, okay, like I want initiative to be a little bit more realistic in the sense that it's flexible, that, you know, sometimes this person might go first one round, but, you know, then another person might go first a different round. And so I'm going to have this way. So at every point of the round ending, we're going to re-roll initiatives based off of these different things so that initiative order changes every time. And at first I was like, okay, yeah, that's interesting, because I do think that there's some like realism elements of like, you know, not everyone's just going to go in a circle every time, you know, but I very quickly kind of noticed of like that like extra 20 to 30 seconds every single round or a minute every single round of like, okay, now everybody re-roll. Now let's calculate all the numbers again. Okay, now let's shift around the slots. Okay, like, okay, now we have the new order. Now let's go. Like that little bit slowed the game down to me enough that I felt it drag a lot for me personally. And that's not to say that the system is bad on the whole, but for me, it didn't work. And it was kind of a realization of like, it's not necessarily that I like crunch or that I like dense mechanics or that I like realism. Like I care that the game goes fast, you know? So I want the game to have the game, but I also want the game to move quickly and for resolution to be noticeable, immediate, and efficient. I wouldn't have necessarily realized that if I didn't see the opposite version of that, where the game is slower, a little bit more cumbersome, a little bit more, you know, fine-grained in certain ways. And like that's affected the way that I design my own games now, where it's like, okay, that's a cool idea, but it slows the game down in a way that I don't quite want. So I want to come up with an idea that's going to be very fast, very efficient, where you can, you know, roll the dice and immediately know what happens and immediately be able to go back into the game, not having to sit there and like parse everything out. Like that's a realization that I had, not because I saw somebody do it that way, but because I saw somebody do it the opposite way and thought like, that didn't work for me. Why didn't it work for me? Because it slows the game down. Oh, I care about the game being fast. I didn't know that before. Like I didn't consciously know that before, but I do now because I saw that. So it can be a double-edged, you know, a double-edged sword in both of them being good edges of like seeing the good and the bad of, or what you like and what you don't like is a better way to say it, of certain ways of designing can both illuminate your own process by kind of helping you refine the range on either end into what direction you ultimately end up wanting to go.
So it's funny, Jeff, what you say about like, for me, I found out that people know what they don't like. Sometimes they don't know what they do like. And a perfect way to do it is to say, like, everyone that I know goes through this same process, which is trying to decide what food you're going to eat for dinner. And it is the first worldest of all the first world problems, but especially if we're going to go out to eat, I've learned to find out where people will not go. That goes so much faster. So it's like, okay, what don't you want? My wife's like, I really don't want X. Perfect. So now, and it's so much quicker than if I say, what do you want? And so that's actually a really clever way of, you know, I think that is some of the best game design that happens, is when you find a problem on accident and you're like, I don't like that that's slow. Because immediately while you were talking, I was like, well, there's two different ways to do that. Everyone bumps up one so you don't roll again, or if there are actual markers, you shuffle the markers and it's just randomized, so it's like really quick. But that's where good game design can come from, is just, I don't like this. Let's solve a problem. And I think that when you try it and then you see me do it and you're like, oh, that's a good idea, but this is this and this. More and more RPGs being collaborative in terms of how they're created makes more sense to me because of how collaborative they are in play. So it makes so much sense to me that it bleeds out into their meta. And I think that it's a really cool thing to not just be aware of, but lean into as a community. And I'm going to try to do that more. So tell us in the comments, what is one of the most interesting things you've seen in a game that you wish other games would adopt? What's that cool thing? Like, I found out that disadvantage in D&D is actually, from what I've been told, from a far earlier game. It's like a Mech Warrior game where it was 2 dice. And initially when they were designing it, they were like, no, people want tables and this is too simplistic. And it's like, hey, what is that thing that you wish that other games would adopt, where you're like, oh no, this is that thing that I love it. Is it range bands or what else? Or excuse me, conversely, what is something you wish someone would come up with something better for? What's that pain in your game design craw? And put it in the comments. We're Tabletop Terrors. We're all about fun, creativity, and tabletop games. If you like that, consider subscribing. Let's end this with a Tabtarian toast.
May you mend the first break.
May you kill the first snake.
May you conquer everything you undertake.
So in the current system I'm working on, I had an idea for initiative where each of the players is, as part of character creation, assigned a number. And then the way initiative works is you slot in the monsters or other creatures or anybody else, but everybody always knows their number. And obviously that could change if they leveled up, say. But the idea is everybody's in the same order, but to make it more dynamic, you roll on which order you go through the numbers. So the GM goes, okay, this time we're going backwards starting from, and roll a die 3. So 3 is first, and then it'll go 2 and 1. And again, the numbers aren't always in sequence, so you can put things in between. But then sometimes you go, okay, I need to roll to see who this attacks. Well, you have a number, so as long as it can fit on a die, I can roll and go, okay, well, number 3, well, it's you this time. Or, we're going to start with 7 and then go around. So 7 and then 1, And specifically, my goal was to try and make it faster, but also so dynamic that it wasn't like you couldn't create a situation where one character had an ability, so they were always first, so that they always did theirs, and then the next guy did a stun, and then, you know what I mean? And so you couldn't game the initiative system, basically.